he brought 5 of them over to the big house, and he said, I want you to have these. I said, Brian, these are yours. These were all from Capitol Records. They were the white background, the linen backgrounds. They were absolute gold records. To Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys. I said, Brian, I can't take these things. These are your awards, man. No, I want you to have them. I said, Brian, I'm telling you right now, I can't. We'll put them in a car later, and that'll be that. You go back up in your office or whatever. And so at one point, he was carrying them. I ran upstairs to use the bathroom or something. And when I came back, he was gone. And I thought nothing of it. That was it, you know. He kind of made his daily run. And I would see him in the next day or two. And then the maid came in. Several hours later, she was cleaning up, and she said, Mister. And I walked downstairs, and she was to my office, and there were 3 of those 5 great big records.
I think at the time, in the context of the times, they were a childish thing that people thought had to be thrown away by the end of the decade. I think largely the public perception of them was that they were, that they were past it. They were part of the embarrassing part of your past that you didn't want your newer, hipper friends to know about. I think, at least popularly, I think people that really understood music and really understood the artistry that Brian was capable of never lost their interest in him.
One of my jobs in 1970 was going out on the road and selling the Warner Brothers sales and promotion staff on promoting the Beach Boys. And they're already a legendary group in 1970, and they're still well known, still touring, and they're very well known. And Add Some Music comes out, which is the first single, and it's a struggle to get radio stations to go on it. And ultimately, I don't think it made it past the 40s on the Billboard chart, I don't believe. And it was a real struggle. So there were certain radio stations across America that were called breakout stations. In other words, if you could get your record on one of those stations, either because of the notoriety or the credibility of the program director who added the record, because he was so well respected, or because the radio station was respected, or because the market was respected, you knew that if you could get it on one of those stations, that 8 or 10 or 20 or 30 other stations might follow and add the record. And one of those stations was WFIL in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And FIL was where American Bandstand was filmed, because they had a television affiliate. So it was a great, legendary rock and roll radio station with a great tradition and, a great history to it. And the program director there was a guy named Jay Cook, who I knew because I'd met him at conferences and I'd met him at music events, radio and record events. And he was a very nice guy. At that time, probably in his mid-30s would be my guess. Very well thought of, very well respected in radio circles. And he's the program director of WFIL in Philadelphia. That's a top 10 market in the United States. So I knew going into that meeting with him that if I could get Jay to add some music to your day, I would get a lot of smaller stations, the Harrisburg PAs and the Trenton, New Jerseys, and all the little secondaries around Philadelphia. I know that they would most likely add it because by Jay adding it, that was giving them the go-ahead to add the record. They could feel safe in adding the record. So I went into the meeting, and back in those days, promotion guys would call on these radio stations all the time, in person and on the telephone. And they were all record promotion guys. They all represented record companies, whether it was an RCA, a Capitol, whether it was a smaller independent label. They called on these guys frequently. But they were all record promotion guys, right? So when I went in to speak to Jay, I was going in as the manager of the Beach Boys, which kind of elevated my credibility. And he saw me without an appointment, basically. I mean, it was kind of a last-minute thing. I'm going to be there. Can I come by and see you? Yeah, you'd love to. So I go into his office, and I'm in this historic radio television station, WFIL, and I'm looking back, just thinking maybe 13, 14 years before that, I was coming home every day after school, and I was turning on ABC television, and I was watching Dick Clark and all the kids on American Bandstand playing the latest records and doing the latest dances and rate the records. And, I give it a 10 because you can dance to it. That was the old thing. And here I am in this legendary radio station, but I know that I've got to get Jay to play this record. I've got to get him to play Add Some Music to Your Day, because we need to get a station of that caliber to give the record momentum. Not only would we get additional radio stations in the market, secondary radio stations in the region, but we would also most likely go up a couple of slots, a couple of notches on the Billboard chart, which would mean a lot. It would mean sales, it would mean a shot in the arm, so to speak. So Jay didn't want to really talk about the record initially in the conversation. He wanted to talk about Brian. He wanted to talk about the guy that he'd grown up listening to, and he'd started out at small radio in the early 60s, and he was working his way up as the Beach Boys were becoming more and more popular. He was becoming more and more popular. He was getting better jobs, and he was going up the chain, to different radio stations. So he wanted to tell me how important Brian and the Beach Boys' music was and how great the records were. And he wanted to know what we were working on, and he wanted to know about touring, and he wanted to know how, he wanted to know, all that, and he was picking my brain, and we were having a great conversation. And I'm thinking to myself, this guy's going to add to the record. He loves Brian. He's admitted that he is a huge Brian Wilson fan. And I'm thinking, he's going to add to the record, and that's going to break this record on the East Coast. If I have Philadelphia, then I can go after Boston. Then I can go after New York. Then I can go after Atlanta. And I'm thinking, this is going to be great. And there's a certain time in sales that salesmen call, they call it going for the order or calling for the order. It's time basically to stop the chit-chat and get them to sign the contract, do the deal. And so I said to myself, it's time to go for the order. It's time to ask Jay, will you play Add Some Music to Your Day? And I asked Jay, I said, Jay, we're promoting a new single from the new upcoming album, Sunflower, and would you please, add the record? We really need your help on this on the East Coast, and will you add the single? And he looked at me and he said, Fred, I can't add the record. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, I can't go on the record. I said, well, you just got done telling me how important Brian is and the music of the Beach Boys and how it influenced your life, and you're telling me you can't add this new record? And he said, that's what I'm telling you. And I said, why? And he looked at me, and I will never forget this as long as I live. He looked at me and said, Fred, the Beach Boys aren't hip anymore. The Beach Boys aren't hip anymore. Well, Jay's gone. FIL is probably all Spanish for all I know, talk, sports. They're a thing of the past. They no longer influence what the kids are listening to on the radio. It's been 40 years since he said the Beach Boys aren't hip anymore. 40 years later, we're still playing the Beach Boy music. Mike and Bruce are still selling concert tickets. Brian has released several solo albums to enormous critical review.